Ladies, I need to share a story that will make you question everything you think you know about successful marriages. As a male blogger who spent the last decade writing about relationships, I've heard countless stories of infidelity, divorce, and financial manipulation. But nothing prepared me for what I witnessed when I met Sarah Williams at a Manhattan coffee shop 6 months ago. What started as a routine interview for my blog about successful women's midlife transformations became a masterclass in recognizing narcissistic abuse, strategic planning, and the devastating power of women who finally decide to fight back. Sarah's story isn't just about divorce, it's about a complete life transformation that every woman over 35 needs to hear. This is the story of how a millionaire's wife became his most expensive mistake, and why every woman reading this should pay attention to the warning signs Sarah missed for 20 years. The steady beeping of monitors at Mount Sinai Hospital cut through the antiseptic air like a metronome counting down to justice. When I first saw Sarah Williams in that hospital bed, 6 months pregnant and bruised but somehow radiating quiet strength, I knew I was looking at a woman who had finally found her power. "Mr. Chen," she said, her voice steady despite the circumstances, "I called you because I want other women to hear this story. Not the sanitized version that will appear in divorce court records, but the real story of how a successful marketing executive spent 20 years being financially and emotionally abused by her millionaire husband, and how she finally fought back." Detective Martinez sat beside her bed, his notepad filled with details that would eventually send David Williams to federal prison. Sarah's attorney, Rebecca Goldman, shuffled through papers that would secure one of the largest divorce settlements in New York State history. Her best friend, Maria Santos, held Sarah's hand while providing the kind of unwavering support that only comes from women who truly understand each other. "The baby," Sarah whispered, her hand instinctively moving to her swollen belly. "Your daughter is perfectly healthy," Dr. Jennifer Kim assured her, checking the monitors that had been tracking both mother and child since the ambulance arrived. "You're incredibly fortunate, Mrs. Williams." Fortunate. The word seemed absurd given the circumstances, but as I listened to Sarah's story over the following weeks, I realized she was right. The fall down those marble stairs caused by her husband's violent shove had given her the final piece of evidence she needed to destroy the man who had been systematically stealing from their marriage for months. "Detective Martinez," Sarah said, her voice growing stronger, "I need to tell you something important. My husband didn't just argue with me tonight. He pushed me down those stairs. And I have proof." The detective's eyebrows rose. "What kind of proof, Mrs. Williams?" "Security cameras," Sarah replied, remembering the neighbor's doorbell camera that captured their building's entrance. "Mrs. Patterson across the hall has one of those Ring doorbells. She mentioned it records everything that happens in our hallway." As Detective Martinez made notes about securing the footage, I found myself marveling at Sarah's clarity. Here was a woman who had just survived a violent assault by her husband, yet she was thinking strategically about evidence and documentation. This wasn't luck or coincidence. This was the result of 3 weeks of careful planning by a woman who had finally recognized the true nature of her marriage. "Detective," Sarah continued, "what I'm about to tell you might sound unbelievable, but my husband has been planning to destroy me financially for months. He's been having an affair with his assistant, Jessica Walsh, and I discovered it 3 weeks ago. You confronted him tonight." "I confronted him about more than just the affair," Sarah said, her voice taking on the measured tone of the successful executive she had always been. "I confronted him about the offshore accounts, the hidden assets, and his plan to leave me with nothing after our baby was born." Detective Martinez leaned forward. "Mrs. Williams, these are serious allegations. Do you have evidence to support them?" Sarah smiled for the first time since I'd met her, despite the pain in her ribs. "Detective, I've been married to a narcissistic man for 20 years. I learned a long time ago to document everything. My lawyer has files that will make your head spin." As if summoned, Rebecca Goldman appeared in the doorway, her designer suit wrinkled from rushing to the hospital. Behind her stood Maria Santos, her warm brown eyes filled with worry and barely controlled rage. "Mija," Maria said, rushing to Sarah's bedside, "I came as soon as Rebecca called. How are you feeling?" "Like I just survived a war," Sarah replied honestly, "but I'm ready to fight back." Rebecca approached Detective Martinez with the confidence of someone who had spent 15 years practicing Manhattan family law. "Detective, I'm Mrs. Williams's attorney. I need to inform you that we've been building a case against David Williams for financial abuse and domestic violence for the past 3 weeks." "You saw this coming?" the detective asked. "We prepared for the possibility," Rebecca said carefully. Sarah had documented several incidents of escalating behavior. Tonight's assault was the culmination of months of emotional and financial abuse. As I watched this scene unfold, I realized I was witnessing something extraordinary. Sarah Williams hadn't just survived an attack by her millionaire husband. She had orchestrated a legal trap that would destroy him completely. The vulnerable pregnant wife David thought he was manipulating had been gathering evidence, building alliances, and preparing for war. "Detective," Sarah said, "my husband thinks he's won something tonight. He thinks he's silenced me or scared me into submission. But what he's actually done is hand me the final piece of evidence I need to destroy him financially and send him to prison." The monitors beeped steadily as Sarah's heart rate remained calm and controlled. For the first time in months, she felt completely clear about her path forward. Her daughter deserved better than a father who would push a pregnant woman down marble stairs. Her daughter deserved a mother who would fight back against abuse and win. "I want to press charges," Sarah said firmly. "And I want to make sure that security footage is preserved as evidence." Detective Martinez nodded. "We'll get a warrant for the video immediately. Mrs. Williams, I have to ask, are you sure you're ready for what comes next? Cases like this can get complicated." Sarah looked at Maria, whose supportive smile gave her strength, then at Rebecca, whose confident nod promised legal victory. Finally, she placed both hands on her belly, feeling her daughter move inside her. "Detective," she said, "I've been preparing for this fight longer than you know. David Williams just made the biggest mistake of his life. He's about to learn that pushing the wrong woman down the stairs can cost a millionaire everything he owns." The rain continued to fall against the hospital windows. But inside the room, Sarah Williams began planning her victory with the precision of the successful executive she had always been. Her divorce settlement would be legendary. Her midlife transformation would be complete. And her daughter would grow up knowing that women supporting women could change everything. As I left the hospital that night, I knew Sarah's story would become the most important piece I'd ever written. Not because of the money involved, or even the dramatic circumstances, but because it perfectly illustrated a truth that every woman over 35 needs to understand. Recognizing abuse isn't enough. Fighting back strategically is what separates survivors from victims. Sarah Williams was about to show every woman in America what victory looks like when you refuse to stay down. 3 weeks before the fall, that would change everything. Sarah Williams sat across from her husband David at Le Bernardin, one of Manhattan's most exclusive restaurants. To every observer, they appeared to be the perfect successful couple. She, a polished marketing executive in her early 40s, with a thriving consultancy. He, a commanding real estate mogul who controlled a $50 million empire. But as I learned when interviewing Sarah months later, perfection built on lies is the most dangerous kind of foundation. "Michael," Sarah told me during one of our conversations, "I spent 20 years thinking I was living the American dream. Beautiful home in Connecticut, penthouse in Manhattan, successful careers, social status that most people only dream about. I thought David's occasional coldness was just the stress of managing a growing business. I thought his increasing control over our finances was him being protective. I thought his criticism of my emotional reactions was helpful feedback." The night at Le Bernardin should have been a celebration. Sarah had just learned she was pregnant at 42, a surprise baby that felt like a gift after years of focusing on careers. She had rehearsed how to tell David, imagining his joy, planning how they would share the news with family and friends. Instead, she watched her husband check his phone every 30 seconds while she delivered the most important news of their marriage. "David," Sarah said, reaching across the table to cover his restless fingers, "I have something important to tell you." "Make it quick, sweetheart," David replied, his eyes already drifting to his buzzing phone. "I've got 3 conference calls tonight about the Madison Avenue property deal. We're looking at a $15 million acquisition that could change everything for the company." Sarah took a deep breath. "David, we're pregnant." The silence that followed lasted exactly 23 seconds Sarah had counted, a detail that would later help her recognize how differently David processed personal versus business information. "Pregnant," David repeated, as if the word were foreign. "Are you sure 6 weeks?" Sarah confirmed, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "I wanted to wait until I was certain." David's phone buzzed again, and Sarah could see the name on the screen, Jessica Walsh. His 26-year-old assistant had been calling with increasing frequency, always about urgent meetings that couldn't wait. "Congratulations, darling," David said finally, though his voice lacked warmth. He raised his wine glass, then seemed to remember her condition and awkwardly lowered it. "This is wonderful news." But Sarah caught the hesitation, the way his smile didn't reach his eyes, the subtle glance toward his phone as Jessica's name appeared again. 20 years of marriage had taught her to read the micro-expressions that crossed David's face when he was calculating something. "David, aren't you happy?" she asked quietly. "Of course I'm happy," he said, suddenly animated as if remembering his role. He stood and moved around the table, pressing a kiss to her temple as other diners watched. "To my beautiful wife and our growing family," he announced. The gesture felt performative, but Sarah forced herself to smile as nearby tables raised their glasses in acknowledgement. For a moment, the scene looked exactly like the life they had spent 20 years building. "I should call my mother," Sarah said. "She'll be thrilled." "Let's wait," David suggested quickly. "You know how she gets. Maybe we should keep it between us for a few weeks." Sarah nodded, though something cold settled in her stomach. In 20 years, David had never suggested keeping good news from family. His phone buzzed again. "Jessica, I told you I was having dinner with my wife," he said, but his tone was gentler than Sarah expected for an employee. "The contracts can wait." "No, you're right. This is time sensitive." He covered the phone and looked at Sarah apologetically. "Sweetheart, I'm sorry, but this Madison Avenue deal is falling apart. I need to take this and probably head back to the office." "David, we just announced that we're having a baby," Sarah said, trying to keep her voice level. "Can't business wait for one evening?" "You know how these deals work," David said, already standing. "One delay and we lose millions. Jessica has the contracts ready, and if we don't get them signed tonight, the sellers will walk." He placed $300 on the table and kissed Sarah's forehead with mechanical affection before heading for the exit, while still talking to Jessica Walsh. Sarah sat alone at their table, surrounded by couples celebrating anniversaries and engagements, feeling like an actress who had forgotten her lines. When the waiter approached to offer her a car, she accepted gratefully, though she made no move to leave immediately. Instead, she sat in the elegant restaurant and tried to ignore the voice in her head that whispered about red flags and warning signs. How many times had she explained away his late nights, his distraction, his phone calls behind closed doors? How many times had she told herself that building a real estate empire required sacrifices from both partners? Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from Maria Santos. "How did he take the news, mija? I'm dying to know." Instead of her usual diplomatic response, Sarah found herself writing, "He took a call from his assistant and left me sitting here alone. I think we need to talk soon." Maria's response came immediately. "I'm coming to get you right now." And Sarah, trust your instincts. As Sarah waited for her best friend, she made a mental note to start paying attention differently. The successful executive in her recognized that something wasn't adding up in David's behavior, and after 20 years of marriage, she deserved to know the truth. What struck me most when Sarah told me this story, I wrote in my notes that night, was how clearly she could articulate the exact moment she started questioning her reality. Most women I interviewed talk about gradual realization or slowly growing suspicions. Sarah pinpointed the precise second when her husband's reaction to life-changing news revealed his true priorities. This is crucial for women to understand. Narcissistic men don't suddenly become abusive. They reveal who they've always been when circumstances no longer allow them to maintain their masks. David's reaction to Sarah's pregnancy wasn't the beginning of his selfishness. It was the moment his selfishness became impossible to hide. Sarah's journey from trusting wife to strategic opponent began that night in Le Bernardin. Though she didn't know it yet, the woman who had built a successful marketing firm from nothing was still there, buried under 20 years of accommodating David's needs above her own. That woman wouldn't accept being abandoned in a restaurant after sharing life-changing news. That woman would start paying attention to details David thought she was too naive to notice. As Maria Santos drove Sarah home that night, neither woman could have imagined that Sarah's transformation from victim to victor was just beginning. They couldn't have predicted that David's casual dismissal of his wife's pregnancy announcement would eventually cost him everything he had spent his life building. But Sarah's instincts were already stirring. The successful executive who had learned to read client behavior, analyze market data, and recognize patterns was turning those skills toward her own marriage for the first time in 20 years. David Williams had just made his first serious mistake. He had shown his true face to a woman smart enough to recognize what she was seeing. Sarah's midlife transformation was beginning, and her millionaire husband had no idea he was about to face the most formidable opponent of his life. The perfect marriage was about to reveal its hidden cracks, and Sarah Williams was about to discover that she was strong enough to break free from anything built on lies. The morning sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Williams penthouse, illuminating 20 years of carefully curated perfection. Sarah moved through their Manhattan home like a detective in her own life, noting details she had previously dismissed as normal marriage stress. David's side of their California king bed lay empty, sheets perfectly made. Another late night at the office. He had texted at midnight. Another urgent deal that couldn't wait. Another evening when Jessica Walsh's name appeared on their phone bill more frequently than Sarah's own mother. As I learned during my interviews with Sarah, this was the morning she stopped making excuses and started gathering evidence. Michael, Sarah told me, the difference between being a victim and being a survivor often comes down to one decision, the decision to start documenting what's actually happening instead of what you're being told is happening. Sarah paused at David's home office door, noting that it was locked for the first time in 20 years. She tried the handle again, confirming what her marketing executive instincts were screaming. Something was fundamentally wrong. The coffee maker beeped, and Sarah poured herself decaf before settling at their granite kitchen island, with the mail David had left scattered across the surface. Bills, investment statements, credit card statements he usually handled personally. Sarah had never been one to snoop, but pregnancy hormones and growing suspicion made her bold. She opened the American Express statement first, scanning charges with the attention to detail that had made her successful in analytics. Tiffany & Co., $800. Sarah touched her bare neck, realizing she hadn't received jewelry from David in months. Le Bernardin, $400 for dinner for two. On a night David claimed to be working late. The Carlisle Hotel, $300 for afternoon tea, when David was supposedly in client meetings. Each charge told a story Sarah wasn't part of. Her phone rang, Maria Santos calling like a lifeline. Mija, how are you feeling this morning? Maria's voice carried concern that made Sarah's chest tight. Like I'm losing my mind, Sarah admitted. Maria, I think David might be having an affair. The silence stretched before Maria responded carefully. What makes you think that? Credit card charges for dinners and hotels when he's supposedly working. Jessica calling at all hours. He locked his office door. Maria, in 20 years, he's never locked that door. Have you talked to him about it? Sarah laughed bitterly. Talk to David. You know how that goes. He'll tell me I'm being paranoid, that pregnancy hormones are making me irrational, that he works hard to provide for our family. Same script every time I question anything. That's called gaslighting, Maria said gently. Making you question your own reality when you're asking legitimate questions. The word hit Sarah like a physical blow. Gaslighting. She had heard the term in articles about emotional abuse, but had never applied it to her own marriage. David was successful, charming, respected. He couldn't be abusive. Could he? Maria, I need you to be completely honest with me about something. Always, Mija. At the country club, at dinner parties, when I'm not around, do people talk about David and other women? Another pause. Sarah, please, I need to know. Maria sighed deeply. There have been whispers. Nothing concrete, but Jessica Walsh is young and beautiful, and she accompanies David to business functions where spouses aren't invited. Some of the other wives have mentioned it. Sarah felt her world shifting. Why didn't you tell me? Because I hoped I was wrong? Because you seemed happy? Because telling your best friend her husband might be cheating is complicated as hell? Sarah set down her coffee with shaking hands. I need to know the truth. Maria, I need to know what I'm dealing with before this baby comes. What are you thinking? I'm thinking I need to hire a private investigator, Sarah said, the words feeling foreign. I'm thinking I need to protect myself and my daughter financially. I'm thinking the man who left me alone in a restaurant after I told him we're pregnant might not be the father I want for my child. Divorce, Maria asked quietly. I don't know yet, but I need information. Real information, not just suspicions and credit card charges. Sarah heard David's key in the front door and quickly scattered the statements back across the counter. I have to go. He's home. Sarah, Maria said urgently, if you're really going to do this, be careful. Men like David don't like losing control, and they especially don't like being investigated. David entered the kitchen looking exhausted but still handsome in his rumpled suit. He kissed Sarah's forehead automatically, the same gesture he'd given her for years. Morning, sweetheart. Sorry I was so late. The Madison Avenue deal got complicated. How is Jessica handling all the late nights? Sarah asked casually, testing the waters. David's hand paused while reaching for coffee. Jessica's a professional. She does whatever the job requires. She's very dedicated, Sarah continued. Calling during our dinner the other night, working such long hours. She must not have much of a personal life? Sarah, what exactly are you implying? David's voice carried a warning edge. Nothing, she said quickly, falling back into old patterns. Just making conversation. But as David gathered his mail, Sarah watched his face for micro-expressions. She saw the slight relief when he collected the credit card statements, the quick scan to see if anything was missing, the casual way he locked them in his briefcase. After 20 years of marriage, Sarah realized she had become an expert at reading her husband's attempts to hide things from her. The question was, what was she going to do about it? As David left for the office, Sarah made her first concrete decision. She opened her laptop and searched for private investigators in Manhattan. It was time to stop being naive about her own life. This is the moment, I wrote in my analysis of Sarah's story, when a victim becomes a survivor, not when she leaves, not when she confronts her abuser, but when she decides to gather information and document reality. Sarah's marketing background gave her an advantage many women don't have. She understood that data beats intuition in any battle. Sarah's millionaire husband was about to discover that his wife was smarter and more determined than he had ever given her credit for. The foundation of their perfect life was about to crack wide open, and Sarah intended to be the one controlling how it fell apart. Her midlife transformation was accelerating, though she didn't yet know how completely her life was about to change. All she knew was that her daughter deserved a mother who would fight for the truth, no matter how painful it might be. David Williams had just lost the luxury of Sarah's willful blindness. From this morning forward, she would be watching, documenting, and preparing for the possibility that her marriage was built on lies. The most dangerous opponent for any narcissistic husband is a smart wife who has stopped making excuses for his behavior. David was about to learn this lesson in the most expensive way possible. Sarah had returned from her 12-week pregnancy checkup with ultrasound photos of her daughter's perfectly formed fingers when she heard David's phone ringing from their master bathroom. He was in the shower, steam fogging the glass walls of their marble enclosure, completely unaware that his iPhone was buzzing insistently on the granite countertop. Without thinking, Sarah answered it. Hello, David's phone. Baby, I can't wait anymore. When are you telling her about us? The voice was young, breathless, familiar. Jessica Walsh. The words hit Sarah like a physical blow, confirming her worst fears in a single sentence. Her hands shook as she held the phone, listening to silence as Jessica realized her mistake. Who is this? Jessica asked, though her tone suggested she already knew. Sarah found her voice, cold and professional. This is David's wife. The woman you apparently think he's going to leave for you. The sharp intake of breath was followed by the line going dead. Sarah sat heavily on their bed, staring at the ultrasound photos scattered around her, trying to process that her marriage was over. When I interviewed Sarah about this moment months later, she described it as the instant when 20 years of self-doubt crystallized into absolute clarity. Michael, she said, I had spent weeks questioning my instincts, wondering if I was being paranoid or irrational. But hearing Jessica call my husband baby and ask when he was leaving his pregnant wife that removed all ambiguity, I knew exactly what I was dealing with. David emerged from the shower, reaching for his towel, completely unaware that his world had just shifted permanently. Sarah, what's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost. Jessica called, Sarah said simply, watching his face for the reaction she now knew to expect. David's expression shifted through confusion, recognition, fear, and finally anger. What did she say? She asked when you were going to tell me about the two of you. Sarah replied, her voice deadly calm. She called you baby. David, your assistant called my husband baby and asked when he was leaving his pregnant wife. Sarah, you're being paranoid, David said, but his voice lacked conviction. Jessica is young and confused. She probably has a crush, but nothing has happened between us. You know how these young girls get around successful men? The gaslighting was so immediate, so automatic, that Sarah almost laughed. Instead, she stood and faced him directly. David, she knows things about your schedule that I don't know. She calls you at all hours. She goes to business dinners I'm not invited to. And now she's asking when you're leaving me. Don't insult my intelligence. Your pregnancy hormones are making you irrational, David continued, moving toward his closet with studied casualness. Jessica is an employee, a valuable employee, but nothing more. Pregnancy hormones, Sarah repeated, feeling something snap inside her. David, I built a marketing company from nothing. I analyze data and behavioral patterns for a living. Don't you dare blame my ability to recognize obvious patterns on pregnancy hormones. David's jaw tightened, and Sarah saw a flash of anger that had been hiding beneath his charm. I work my ass off for this family. Sarah, I provide everything you could possibly want. This penthouse, your car, your jewelry, your lifestyle, all of it comes from my work. And my work requires long hours and professional relationships that you apparently can't handle. Professional relationships don't call each other baby, Sarah shot back. You misheard her. I recorded it. The lie came out so naturally that Sarah surprised herself. But the effect on David was immediate and telling. His face went white, then red, then white again. You recorded my private phone calls. I answered your phone when you were in the shower. David, and I'm very glad I did, because now I know exactly what kind of man I married. David's charm offensive began immediately. He sat beside her, his voice becoming gentle and concerned. Sarah, sweetheart, you're stressed about the pregnancy, about work, about everything. Let me make this right. How about we take a long weekend in the Hamptons? Just the two of us. No phones, no work, no distractions. Sarah looked at her husband of 20 years and realized she was seeing a stranger. The manipulation was so smooth, so practiced, that she wondered how many times he had used these exact techniques without her recognizing them. David, are you having an affair with Jessica Walsh? No, he said without hesitation, but his eyes didn't meet hers. Are you planning to leave me after our daughter is born? Sarah, that's crazy. Why would I leave my family? Are you hiding assets from me? What kind of question is that everything I earn belongs to both of us? Sarah walked to their bedroom window, looking out at the Manhattan skyline. David, I want you to understand something very clearly. I am not the naive woman you married 20 years ago. I am not going to be gaslighted, manipulated, or lied to. If you are having an affair, I will find out. If you are planning to leave me, I will be prepared. And if you are hiding money from me, my lawyers will find every penny. Lawyers! David's voice sharpened. Sarah, you're talking like we're getting divorced. Over a misunderstood phone call from my assistant, I'm talking like a woman who just discovered her husband is planning to abandon her and their unborn child. Sarah replied. I'm talking like someone who deserves the truth about her own life. David began getting dressed with angry movements. Fine. You want the truth. The truth is that I work 16-hour days to maintain the lifestyle you're accustomed to. The truth is that Jessica Walsh is the best assistant I've ever had. And yes, she's attractive and grateful for her job. The truth is that you've become suspicious and paranoid, and it's making our marriage miserable. The truth, Sarah said quietly, is that you just confirmed you're attracted to your assistant. You appreciate her gratitude in ways that have nothing to do with work, and you think your wife is the problem for noticing. David froze with his shirt halfway buttoned. I want you to leave, Sarah continued. Pack a bag and stay somewhere else tonight. I need time to think, and I need space from your lies. Sarah, you're being dramatic. This is our home. This is my home too. David, and right now, I don't want you in it. David finished dressing in silence. his movements sharp with barely controlled anger. At the bedroom door, he turned back. "You're making a huge mistake. Sarah, you're destroying our marriage over nothing." "I'm not destroying anything. David, I'm just finally seeing it clearly." After he left, Sarah sat alone holding the ultrasound photos of her daughter. She had spent 20 years building a life with a man who could lie to her face without hesitation, who could gaslight her even when caught in an obvious affair, who could make her feel crazy for believing her own ears. But she also realized something else: she wasn't crazy. Her instincts were correct. Her analytical skills were sharp. Her ability to recognize patterns was exactly what she needed to navigate the next phase of her life. Sarah picked up her phone and called Maria Santos. "Mija, what's wrong?" "I need the name of that divorce lawyer you mentioned. And Maria, I think I'm about to become a single mother." "What happened?" "I just caught my husband in an affair, and he tried to convince me it was my imagination. The man who used to tell me I was brilliant now thinks I'm too stupid to recognize obvious lies." "Oh, Sarah, I'm so sorry." "Don't be sorry," Sarah said, surprised by the strength in her own voice. "Be proud. I'm finally waking up." As she hung up, Sarah looked around their perfect penthouse and realized that perfection built on lies wasn't worth preserving. Her daughter deserved better than a father who would abandon his pregnant wife. She deserved better than watching her mother accept abuse as normal. "This phone call," I noted in my interview with Sarah, "represents the classic moment when narcissistic abusers overplay their hand." David had been carefully managing Sarah's access to information for months, but Jessica's call shattered his control in 30 seconds. Sarah's decision to answer that phone was the beginning of David's downfall. Sarah's midlife transformation was accelerating beyond anything she had imagined. The vulnerable pregnant wife David was counting on manipulating no longer existed. In her place was a woman who understood that sometimes the greatest kindness you can show your daughter is teaching her father that women who support each other are devastatingly effective when properly motivated. David Williams was about to learn that his biggest mistake wasn't having an affair with Jessica Walsh. His biggest mistake was believing his own lies about his wife's strength. Marcus Thompson's office on East 47th Street looked exactly like Sarah had imagined: dark wood furniture, leather chairs worn by decades of clients seeking truth about their spouses, and walls lined with certificates from 25 years of NYPD detective work. The man himself was shorter than expected, with graying hair and intelligent eyes that seemed to catalog every detail. "Mrs. Williams," Marcus said in his distinctive gravelly voice, "I've seen it all in 25 years. Rich husbands, poor husbands, smart wives, naive wives. What makes you think your situation is different?" Sarah had prepared for this question during sleepless nights since David moved out. "Mr. Thompson, I'm not here because I think my situation is unique. I'm here because I suspect my husband is smarter and more methodical than most cheating spouses, and I need someone equally smart to prove it." Marcus leaned back, studying her. "Tell me what you know." David Williams owns Williams Real Estate Holdings, valued at approximately $50 million. He's been having an affair with his assistant, Jessica Walsh, age 26. Based on credit card records and behavioral patterns, I believe this affair has been ongoing for at least 6 months. What concerns me more than the affair is the timing. Timing. I'm 12 weeks pregnant with our first child. David's behavior changed dramatically after I told him about the pregnancy. He's become secretive about finances, locked his home office for the first time in 20 years, and Jessica has been promoted from intern to executive assistant with access to all his business accounts. Marcus made notes on a yellow legal pad. "You think he's planning to leave you?" "I think he's planning to leave me with nothing," Sarah corrected. "My husband is methodical about business. If he's going to end our marriage, he'll want to minimize his financial losses. The timing suggests he wants me vulnerable new baby, unable to work full-time, emotionally dependent." "Smart woman," Marcus said approvingly. "Most wives come in here crying about broken hearts. You're talking about protecting your assets." "My heart is broken too," Sarah admitted. "But my daughter's future is more important than my feelings. I need to know what David is planning, how much money we really have, and what Jessica Walsh's role is in all of this." Marcus quoted his rates: $5,000 up front, $200 per hour for surveillance, additional costs for financial investigation. Sarah wrote the check without hesitation. Over the next week, Marcus proved why he commanded premium rates in Manhattan. His surveillance revealed a pattern that was both predictable and infuriating: 3 dinners per week at expensive restaurants with Jessica, 2 overnight trips to supposedly different cities where they shared hotel rooms, and regular afternoon visits to a luxury apartment on the Upper East Side that David was apparently paying for. Jessica Walsh, Marcus reported during their second meeting, lives in a 2-bedroom apartment on East 78th Street. Rent is $4,000 per month, paid by a company called JW Enterprises. JW Enterprises is a shell company owned by Williams Real Estate Holdings. Sarah felt her anger crystallizing into something harder and more useful. He set up his mistress in a company apartment, and he's paying for it with marital assets. Gets worse, Marcus continued. Miss Walsh drives a BMW registered to the same shell company, credit cards, insurance, even her gym membership, all paid for by David through business accounts. How much per month? Conservatively, $15,000. Jessica Walsh is expensive. Sarah did quick calculations. $180,000 per year to maintain his mistress, paid for with money that's half mine. What else did you find? Marcus handed her a second folder. Bank statements show regular transfers to offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. Started about 8 months ago. Same time Jessica was promoted. David's moving money out of accounts you have access to and into accounts you don't know about. How much? $2 million so far. The number hit Sarah like a physical blow. David wasn't just having an affair. He was systematically stealing their joint assets to fund his new life with Jessica. This wasn't a midlife crisis or temporary lapse in judgment. This was calculated financial abuse designed to leave Sarah with nothing. Mr. Thompson, I need you to document everything. Every dinner, every hotel stay, every financial transfer. I want photographs, credit card receipts, travel records, everything that proves what he's doing. Planning to divorce him? Planning to destroy him legally? Sarah corrected. My husband thinks he's smarter than me. He thinks he can steal from me, cheat on me, and leave me holding the bag while he starts fresh with his young mistress. He's about to learn that underestimating your wife is the most expensive mistake a millionaire can make. Marcus smiled for the first time since their initial meeting. Mrs. Williams, I think you and I are going to work very well together. That evening, Sarah met Maria Santos at their favorite wine bar in the village. Maria ordered expensive red wine while Sarah stuck to sparkling water, her pregnancy now visible in how she instinctively protected her growing belly. Mija, you look different, Maria observed. Stronger somehow. I feel different, Sarah admitted. For 20 years, I let David manage our finances, make major decisions, control information. I thought I was being a good wife. I was actually being a fool. You weren't a fool. You were trusting your husband. Same thing, apparently, Sarah said bitterly. But not anymore. Maria, David has stolen $2 million from our marriage, and he's spending $180,000 per year on his mistress. Money that should be going toward our daughter's education, our retirement, our future. What are you going to do? I'm going to take him for everything he's worth, Sarah replied with calm certainty. I'm going to prove financial abuse, adultery, and fraud. I'm going to make sure Jessica Walsh loses her comfortable lifestyle when David loses his money. And I'm going to make sure my daughter inherits what's rightfully hers. Maria raised her wine glass. To women supporting women, and to millionaires who pick the wrong wives to screw over. To my midlife transformation, Sarah replied, clinking her water glass against Maria's wine. I'm just getting started. As they talked, Sarah felt something settling into place inside her. A cold, analytical determination that had nothing to do with hurt feelings and everything to do with protecting her child's future. David had made the mistake of thinking his pregnant wife would be too emotional and vulnerable to fight back strategically. What struck me most about this phase of Sarah's story, I wrote in my notes, was how quickly she transformed from confused wife to strategic opponent once she had real information. Marcus Thompson's investigation didn't just provide evidence. It gave Sarah the confidence that comes from knowing you're not crazy, you're not paranoid, and you're not imagining things. This is crucial for women to understand. Gaslighting only works when victims don't have access to objective evidence. Once Sarah saw bank statements, photographs, and documentation of David's systematic deception, she couldn't be manipulated into questioning her own reality anymore. David Williams was about to discover that his wife had been gathering an army while he was busy planning her destruction. The vulnerable pregnant woman he thought he was manipulating had transformed into a formidable opponent who understood exactly how to dismantle everything he thought he had built. Sarah's journey toward financial independence was accelerating, and her divorce settlement was going to become the cautionary tale every cheating millionaire in Manhattan would whisper about for years to come. Sarah had left her doctor's appointment early after receiving excellent news about her pregnancy. Her daughter was developing perfectly, her blood pressure was normal, and Dr. Kim had cleared her for regular activities, feeling lighter than she had in weeks. Sarah decided to surprise David with lunch at home, hoping they might find a way to discuss their problems like adults. She used her key quietly, not wanting to disturb him if he was on an important call. The penthouse felt different with David living there alone, colder somehow. Despite the expensive furnishings and perfect temperature control, that's when she heard David's voice coming from his home office, the door slightly ajar for the first time since their confrontation about Jessica Walsh. "After the baby comes, I'll figure out the divorce," David was saying, his voice carrying the business-like tone he used for important negotiations. "Sarah won't get half of everything if I play this right." Sarah froze in the hallway, her hand instinctively moving to her belly. She held her breath and moved closer, pulling out her phone and activating the voice recording app with trembling fingers. "The key is timing," David continued, apparently on speakerphone. "Right now she's emotional, pregnant, dependent. After the baby, she'll be even more vulnerable, sleep-deprived, overwhelmed with a newborn, probably dealing with postpartum depression. That's when I'll file papers." "What about the money?" The voice was female, young, familiar. "Jessica Walsh." "The Cayman accounts are clean," David replied. "She doesn't know about them, and they're structured through the business in ways that will be hard to trace. The Madison Avenue property is closing next month, and that's another $15 million she can't touch because it's in the company name." "Baby, what if she fights back?" Jessica's voice carried genuine concern, though Sarah noted it seemed more focused on protecting their lifestyle than any worry about Sarah's well-being. "Sarah won't fight," David said with disturbing confidence. "She's never fought about anything in 20 years. She'll take whatever settlement I offer because she'll be desperate and tired and focused on the baby. Women like Sarah don't have killer instincts." Sarah's free hand clenched into a fist as she continued recording, forcing herself to breathe silently despite the rage building in her chest. "Plus," David continued, "I'll make sure she feels guilty about breaking up our family. I'll play the devoted father angle, suggest joint custody, make her think she's hurting the baby by asking for too much money." Sarah's always been susceptible to guilt manipulation. "How much are you thinking?" Jessica asked. "5 million tops," David replied casually, as if discussing pocket change. "Maybe less if I can prove she's unstable. The pregnancy hormones excuse works both ways if she seems too emotional during proceedings. I can argue she's not thinking clearly." Sarah felt sick. David was discussing the destruction of their 20-year marriage and the financial security of their unborn daughter like a business transaction. Worse, he was planning to use her pregnancy and the vulnerability of new motherhood as weapons against her. "What about the penthouse?" Jessica asked. "Community property, but I can argue business necessity. Client meetings, entertaining investors, I need to maintain appearances for the company. She can take the house in Connecticut." "I hate that house," Jessica said petulantly. "It's so suburban and boring." David laughed, and the sound made Sarah's skin crawl. "Don't worry, baby. Once everything's settled, we'll sell Connecticut and buy something in the Hamptons, somewhere we can really entertain." "I can't wait to be your real wife," Jessica said. "No more sneaking around, no more pretending. I want everyone to know you're mine." "Soon," David promised. "Sarah's too predictable to cause real problems. She'll be hurt and angry for a while, but she'll accept reality. She always does." Sarah ended the recording and backed away from the door on silent feet, her heart pounding so hard she worried the baby could feel it. She made it to the elevator and down to the lobby before the full impact hit her. David wasn't just having an affair. He was planning her complete financial destruction, using her pregnancy and the vulnerability of new motherhood as strategic advantages. He had already moved millions beyond her reach and was planning to manipulate her emotions to accept a settlement that represented less than 10% of their actual assets. Most devastating of all, he knew her well enough to predict exactly how she would react or how the old Sarah would have reacted. He expected her to be passive, guilty, focused on avoiding conflict for the sake of their daughter. Sarah sat in her car in the parking garage for 30 minutes, listening to the recording twice more and taking notes. By the time she was ready to drive away, her shock had crystallized into something much more dangerous: cold, strategic fury. David thought women like Sarah didn't have killer instincts. He was about to discover just how wrong he could be. Sarah drove straight to Rebecca Goldman's law office, calling ahead to demand an emergency appointment. Rebecca met her in the lobby, took one look at her face, and ushered her into a private conference room. "Sarah, what happened?" I recorded my husband planning my financial destruction," Sarah said, her voice deadly calm. "Rebecca, I need to know, in New York State, is it legal to record someone in your own home without their knowledge?" Rebecca's eyebrows rose. "If you're a party to the conversation, yes. If you're recording conversations you're not part of, it's more complicated. What exactly did you record?" Sarah played the recording, watching Rebecca's expression shift from professional interest to outright anger. "Sarah, this recording is admissible evidence of financial fraud and emotional abuse. David just confessed to hiding marital assets, planning to manipulate your emotional state, and using your pregnancy against you in divorce proceedings." "What's it worth?" "Everything," Rebecca said firmly. "With this recording, we can demand full financial disclosure, freeze assets, and argue for maximum settlement based on his attempts at financial abuse. Sarah, your husband just handed us the ammunition to destroy him in court." Sarah felt something settling into place, a cold satisfaction that had nothing to do with revenge and everything to do with justice. "Rebecca, I want you to understand something clearly. This isn't about saving my marriage anymore. This isn't about hurt feelings or broken hearts. This is about making sure my daughter inherits what she's entitled to, and making sure David Williams learns that underestimating his wife was the most expensive mistake of his life." "What do you want me to do?" "I want you to prepare for war," Sarah replied, "because David just declared war on the wrong woman, and I'm going to make sure he loses everything he thinks he's already won." Rebecca smiled grimly. "Sarah, I think your millionaire husband is about to get the education of his lifetime." When I interviewed Sarah about this moment months later, she described it as the instant her transformation became irreversible. "Michael," she said, "hearing David plan to use my postpartum depression against me, hearing him laugh about manipulating my guilt over breaking up our family that killed whatever remaining love I had for him, but more importantly, it showed me exactly who I was dealing with. Not a husband making mistakes, but a predator executing a carefully planned attack on his pregnant wife." Sarah's midlife transformation was accelerating beyond anything she had imagined possible. The vulnerable pregnant wife David was counting on manipulating no longer existed. In her place was a woman who understood that sometimes the greatest kindness you can show your daughter is teaching her father that women supporting women can be devastatingly effective when properly motivated. David Williams was about to learn that his biggest mistake wasn't planning to defraud his wife. His biggest mistake was underestimating her intelligence enough to discuss it where she could hear him. Rebecca Goldman's conference room had been transformed into a war room. Charts covered the mahogany table. Financial documents spread across every surface. And three of Manhattan's most expensive legal minds were dissecting David Williams's business empire like surgeons planning a complex operation. Sarah sat at the head of the table, 24 weeks pregnant and radiating the focused intensity of a successful marketing executive who had finally found a project worthy of her skills. Across from her, Rebecca coordinated with forensic accountant Michael Anderson and private investigator Marcus Thompson, while Maria Santos provided emotional support and Cuban coffee that kept everyone sharp. "Ladies and gentlemen," Rebecca announced, "we are not preparing for a typical Manhattan divorce. We are preparing to dismantle a sophisticated financial fraud operation that happens to involve adultery." Michael Anderson, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses who specialized in finding hidden assets, spread his preliminary findings across the table. "David Williams has been moving money for 8 months. Shell companies in Delaware, offshore accounts in 3 different countries, real estate holdings buried in business partnerships. Very sophisticated, very expensive to set up." "How much?" Sarah asked. Conservatively, $12 million moved out of accounts you had access to. Probably more once we dig deeper. Sarah's hand tightened around her coffee cup. 12 million was more than she had imagined possible. Michael, help me understand something. If David was planning to leave me anyway, why go to such elaborate lengths to hide money? Wouldn't a 50-50 split be cheaper than setting up all these offshore accounts? Michael smiled grimly. Because a 50-50 split of legitimate assets would have given you $25 million. David was planning to leave you with maybe $5 million while keeping $35 million for himself. The cost of hiding money was worth it to save $20 million. Except now we caught him, Rebecca interjected. And in New York, financial fraud during marriage proceedings can result in the innocent spouse receiving more than 50% of assets. Much more. Marcus Thompson pulled out his surveillance photos, spreading them across the table like playing cards. David and Jessica have been careless. They think they're being discreet, but they've established patterns. Same restaurants, same hotel, same apartment 3 nights a week. More importantly, they've been discussing business in public places. What kind of business? Sarah asked. The kind that proves Jessica Walsh isn't just David's mistress, Marcus replied. She's his business partner. The shell company's moving money. She's listed as CEO of 2 of them. The offshore accounts. She has signing authority. David isn't just cheating with Jessica Walsh, he's stealing from you with her active participation. Sarah felt her anger crystallizing into something more useful, strategic determination. Marcus, what does that mean legally? Rebecca answered before Marcus could respond. It means Jessica Walsh can be held liable for her role in defrauding you. She can be forced to return money, pay damages, and potentially face criminal charges for participating in financial fraud. Good, Sarah said simply. I want her to understand that sleeping with married men has consequences beyond hurt feelings. Maria Santos, who had been quietly taking notes, looked up. Mija, I have to ask, are you sure you want to destroy David completely? I mean, he's going to be your daughter's father regardless. Sarah considered the question seriously. Maria, David planned to use my pregnancy and our daughter's infancy to manipulate me into accepting financial crumbs. He planned to hide $35 million from his own child. The recorded conversation proves he sees our daughter as a tool for manipulating me, not as a person deserving financial security. Sarah's right, Rebecca added. David's own words prove he's willing to harm his child's financial future to fund his affair. That's not father behavior, that's narcissistic behavior. Michael Anderson looked up from his analysis. Mrs. Williams, there's something else. The business expansion David's been talking about. The Madison Avenue property deal. It's being financed with money from your joint investment accounts. David is using your money to build assets that will be entirely in his name. Sarah stood and walked to the window overlooking Manhattan. 24 weeks pregnant, she could feel her daughter moving inside her, responding to her elevated heart rate. My daughter deserves better than a father who would steal her inheritance to fund his midlife crisis. She turned back to the room. Rebecca, I want you to file for divorce immediately. I want emergency motions to freeze all accounts, stop all business transactions, and prevent David from leaving the country. I want him to wake up tomorrow morning with no access to any money he's been hiding. Sarah, Rebecca warned, once we file these motions, this becomes public. David will know we've been investigating him, and he'll know we have evidence of his fraud. He's going to be angry. Let him be angry, Sarah replied. I'm done worrying about David's feelings. I'm done protecting a man who was planning to destroy me financially while I was pregnant with his child. Marcus Thompson closed his surveillance folder. Mrs. Williams, men like David don't like losing control. When he realizes you've been investigating him, when he sees those emergency motions, he's going to escalate. Are you prepared for that? Sarah thought about the recording on her phone. David's casual discussion of manipulating her postpartum depression, his confidence that women like her didn't have killer instincts. Marcus, David has been underestimating me for 20 years. He thinks I'm passive, predictable, and weak. He's about to discover that underestimating your wife is the most dangerous mistake a millionaire can make. Maria Santos raised her coffee cup. To women supporting women, and to millionaires who pick the wrong wives to screw over, to financial independence. Rebecca added, to making sure Jessica Walsh learns that being someone's mistress isn't a viable career plan. Michael Anderson concluded. Sarah raised her water glass. To my daughter, who deserves to inherit what's rightfully hers, and to teaching her father that her mother is not someone you can steal from and manipulate. As the meeting concluded, Sarah felt the transformation inside her completing itself. The vulnerable, pregnant wife who had answered Jessica Walsh's phone call 6 weeks ago no longer existed. In her place was a woman who understood that sometimes protecting your child meant destroying their father's ability to harm them. This meeting, I wrote in my analysis, represents the moment when Sarah Williams stopped being David's victim and became his most formidable opponent. The transformation from confused wife to strategic general was complete. David had spent months planning Sarah's destruction, but Sarah had spent weeks assembling an army of professionals who were better at their jobs than David was at his. David Williams was about to discover that his wife had been gathering allies while he was busy planning her destruction. His divorce settlement was going to become legendary in Manhattan legal circles, not because of its size, but because of how completely he had been outmaneuvered by the woman he thought he knew. Sarah's midlife transformation was nearly complete, and her journey toward financial independence was about to accelerate beyond anything David had imagined possible when he first decided to push the wrong woman down his path of narcissistic abuse. The war was about to begin, and Sarah Williams intended to win decisively. The Carlyle Hotel's elegant restaurant hummed with the quiet conversations of Manhattan's elite celebrating David Williams's 46th birthday. Sarah had arrived precisely on time, wearing a designer maternity dress that managed to be both sophisticated and obviously pregnant, a visual reminder to everyone present that David was celebrating his birthday while his wife carried their first child. Rebecca Goldman's legal papers were in Sarah's purse, ready to be served the following morning. Marcus Thompson's surveillance team was documenting David's behavior for the custody evaluation that would inevitably follow. Sarah felt calm and prepared, knowing this would be the last time she would have to pretend their marriage was salvageable. What she hadn't expected was Jessica Walsh. Sarah, darling, you look radiant, David said, kissing her cheek with practiced affection as she approached their table. Pregnancy agrees with you. Thank you, Sarah replied evenly, noting how his eyes kept drifting toward the restaurant entrance. Expecting someone else. Just some colleagues who might stop by, David said vaguely. You know how business dinners work. Sarah knew exactly how business dinners worked, especially when they involved David's young mistress making a public appearance to stake her claim. She ordered sparkling water and settled in to watch her husband dig his own grave deeper. Jessica Walsh arrived 20 minutes later, making an entrance calculated to turn heads. At 26, she possessed the kind of aggressive beauty that demanded attention and platinum blonde hair, designer dress that cost more than most people's rent, and confidence that came from being financially supported by someone else's husband. David, Jessica said breathlessly, approaching their table with a gift bag from Tiffany. I'm so sorry I'm late. The traffic from the office was impossible. Sarah watched the micro-expressions cross David's face. Panic, calculation, and finally resignation, as he realized Jessica wasn't going to maintain the pretense of professional distance. Jessica, David said carefully, I'd like you to meet my wife, Sarah. Of course, Jessica said, extending a manicured hand with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. We've spoken on the phone. The reference to her humiliating phone call was deliberate. Sarah realized. Jessica Walsh wasn't just claiming David publicly, she was asserting dominance over his pregnant wife in front of Manhattan's social elite. Yes, Sarah replied calmly. I remember our conversation well. You asked when David was planning to tell me about your relationship? The nearby tables fell silent, conversations halting as other diners sensed drama unfolding. David's face went white, then red, as he realized his wife was not going to play along with the charade. Sarah, David said through gritted teeth, perhaps we should discuss this privately. I think we're past private discussions. Don't you? Sarah replied, her voice carrying the authority of a successful marketing executive who had learned to command rooms full of hostile clients. Jessica, would you like to join us? I'm sure you have thoughts about David's birthday celebration. Jessica Walsh was young enough to mistake Sarah's calm for weakness. She pulled out a chair and sat down without invitation, placing the Tiffany bag prominently on the table. Actually, Jessica said, David and I were planning to celebrate privately later. We have reservations at that new place in Soho. Sarah felt the restaurant's attention focusing on their table like a spotlight. This was exactly what she had hoped would happen, David and Jessica publicly humiliating themselves while she maintained perfect composure. How thoughtful, Sarah said. David, you didn't mention you had plans after dinner. Should I arrange my own transportation home? David's jaw worked silently. Trapped between his pregnant wife and his young mistress in front of 50 witnesses who would be talking about this scene for months. Jessica, David said finally, perhaps you should go. This is a family dinner. Family dinner. Jessica's voice rose slightly, her youth showing in her inability to read the room. David, we talked about this. You said you were going to tell her about us tonight. The silence in the restaurant was now complete. Sarah could practically hear phones being discreetly pulled from purses as Manhattan's gossip network prepared to document the Williams family's public implosion. Tell me about what? Sarah asked pleasantly, though her heart was racing with adrenaline and vindication. Jessica Walsh, clearly expecting David to support her publicly, forged ahead with the reckless confidence of a young woman who had never experienced real consequences. About our relationship, Jessica said. About our plans to be together once your situation is resolved. My situation, Sarah repeated. You mean my pregnancy, my marriage, my family? Ladies, David interrupted desperately. This isn't the place for this conversation. Actually, Sarah said, standing gracefully despite her pregnant belly, I think this is exactly the place for this conversation. Jessica, I want you to understand something clearly. David isn't leaving me for you. David is leaving our marriage because he's a narcissistic man who thinks he can steal from his pregnant wife and start fresh with someone young enough to be impressed by his money. Jessica's confident smile faltered as Sarah continued. But here's what David hasn't told you. Jessica, he's broke. The offshore accounts he's been using to fund your lifestyle, they're about to be frozen by court order. The apartment he's paying for, that's marital property that will be sold to satisfy his debt to me. The car, the clothes, the jewelry, all of it belongs to me because it was purchased with stolen marital assets. Sarah picked up her purse and looked directly at David, who was staring at her with an expression she had never seen before, genuine fear. David, tomorrow morning you'll be served with divorce papers and emergency motions that will give you access to exactly one checking account with $5,000 in it. Everything else will be frozen pending full financial disclosure. I hope Jessica's feelings for you are genuine, because your ability to fund her lifestyle is about to end permanently. The restaurant remained silent as Sarah walked toward the exit, her head high and her composure intact. Behind her, she could hear Jessica's voice rising in panic and David's desperate attempts to calm her down. Sarah made it to the street before her legs started shaking. She called Maria Santos while walking toward her car. Mija, how did it go? Better than I hoped, Sarah said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. David and Jessica just destroyed themselves publicly in front of half of Manhattan's social elite. And Maria, I think I just found my strength. Sarah, you sound different. Stronger. I feel different, Sarah admitted. I feel like the woman I was before I spent 20 years making myself smaller to accommodate David's ego. I feel like my daughter's mother, and that woman doesn't take shit from anyone. When I interviewed Sarah about this evening months later, she described it as the moment she fully embraced her power. Michael, she said, I had spent 6 weeks gathering evidence and building my case, but I was still operating from a defensive position, trying to protect myself from David's plans. That night at the Carlisle, I went on the offensive for the first time. I stopped trying to save my marriage and started fighting to win my freedom. As Sarah drove home to the penthouse for the last time, she reflected on how completely her life had changed in 8 weeks. The vulnerable wife who had answered Jessica Walsh's phone call was gone. In her place was a woman who could face down her cheating husband and his mistress in public without losing her composure or her sense of purpose. David Williams was about to discover that his wife's transformation was complete and that his own destruction was just beginning. Tomorrow, the legal machinery would begin dismantling everything he thought he had built, and Jessica Walsh would learn that being a millionaire's mistress was only glamorous until the millionaire lost his money. Sarah's journey toward financial independence was accelerating, and her divorce settlement was about to become the cautionary tale every cheating husband in Manhattan would whisper about for years to come. The perfect marriage was officially over, and the perfect revenge was about to begin. Sarah returned to the penthouse at 9 p.m., her body tired from the emotional confrontation at the restaurant, but her mind sharp with anticipation. Tomorrow, Rebecca Goldman would file the papers that would freeze David's assets and expose his fraud. Tomorrow, Jessica Walsh would discover that her luxurious lifestyle was built on stolen money. Tomorrow, Sarah's new life would officially begin. But tonight, she had to face David one last time in the home they had shared for 20 years. The elevator opened onto their marble foyer, and Sarah could hear David's voice immediately sharp, angry, desperate. He was on the phone with someone, probably his lawyer, probably Jessica, probably anyone who might help him figure out how his wife had outmaneuvered him so completely. "I don't care what it costs," David was saying as Sarah hung her coat in the closet. "Find out what she knows and how she knows it. Hire someone, bribe someone, do whatever it takes to stop those papers from being filed." Sarah walked into the living room, her heels clicking against the marble floors. David spun around, his face flushed with anger and panic. His expensive suit was wrinkled, his usually perfect hair disheveled from running his hands through it. "I have to go," David said into the phone, ending the call without pleasantries. "Rough evening?" Sarah asked pleasantly, settling into the leather armchair that had always been her favorite spot for reading. At 28 weeks pregnant, she needed to sit more frequently, but she wasn't going to let physical discomfort show weakness now. "Sarah, what the hell was that performance tonight?" "That wasn't a performance, David. That was the truth. Something you've forgotten how to tell." David began pacing, his movements sharp and agitated. "You humiliated me in front of half of Manhattan. You embarrassed Jessica. You destroyed 20 years of social relationships with one conversation." "I destroyed 20 years of lies with one conversation," Sarah corrected. "The social relationships built on those lies weren't worth preserving." "Sarah, you don't understand what you're doing," David said, his voice taking on the patronizing tone she had learned to recognize as manipulation. "If you file those papers tomorrow, if you freeze our assets, you'll destroy the business. You'll destroy everything we've built together." "Everything we built together," Sarah repeated. "David, you spent 8 months systematically stealing from our marriage to fund your affair. You moved $12 million into accounts I couldn't access. You planned to use my pregnancy and our daughter's infancy to manipulate me into accepting $5 million while you kept $35 million. We didn't build anything together. You built a facade while planning my destruction." David stopped pacing and faced her directly. "How do you know about the offshore accounts? The same way I know about Jessica's apartment, her car, her credit cards, and her salary as CEO of your shell companies." Sarah replied calmly. "I hired professionals. David, real professionals, not the amateurs you're apparently working with." David's face went through several emotions: surprise, fear, calculation, and finally rage. "You had me investigated. You violated my privacy. You invaded my business relationships. I protected myself and our daughter from a man who was planning to steal her inheritance," Sarah said, standing up from the chair. "David, everything you're angry about me discovering, those are things you did. I didn't violate your privacy. I uncovered your crimes." "Crimes?" David's voice rose. "Sarah, you're being dramatic. Moving money between business accounts isn't criminal. Moving marital assets to hide them during divorce planning is fraud," Sarah replied. "Setting up shell companies to funnel money to your mistress is embezzlement. Using business accounts to pay for Jessica's lifestyle is theft of marital property. David, you didn't just cheat on me, you robbed me." David moved closer, his height and bulk suddenly seeming threatening rather than protective. "Sarah, you need to understand something clearly. I built this business from nothing. Every dollar in those accounts came from my work, my clients, my deals. You contributed nothing to this wealth except being a supportive wife. Supporting your business for 20 years while building my own career isn't nothing. David, managing our household, entertaining your clients, representing our family in social situations, that's unpaid labor that contributed to your success." "Unpaid labor?" David's laugh was harsh. "Sarah, you live in a $5 million penthouse, drive a $100,000 car, and carry handbags that cost more than most people make in a month. You've been compensated quite well for your unpaid labor." Sarah felt her own anger rising, but she kept her voice level. David, those things belong to both of us because we're married. They're not payment for services rendered, they're marital property. And tomorrow, when your assets are frozen, you're going to discover exactly how much of your wealth actually belongs to me. David stepped closer again, his face flushed with rage. Sarah, I'm warning you. If you file those papers, if you try to destroy me financially, there will be consequences. Are you threatening me, David? I'm explaining reality to you, David replied. You think you're smart enough to play in my league. You think you understand business and finance well enough to take me on, Sarah? You're a marketing executive who sells cosmetics. I'm a real estate mogul who controls $50 million in assets. We are not equals in this fight. Sarah walked toward the staircase that led to their bedroom, planning to pack the last of her personal items before moving to her new apartment tomorrow. David followed her, his voice rising with each step. You want to know the truth about our marriage? Sarah, the truth is that you've been living off my success for 20 years. The truth is that Jessica appreciates what I've accomplished in ways you never have. The truth is that you're about to destroy the only source of wealth you'll ever have access to because you're too proud to accept reality. Sarah reached the top of the marble staircase and turned to face him. David, the truth is that you're a narcissistic man who thinks his money gives him the right to abuse his pregnant wife. The truth is that Jessica Walsh is a young woman stupid enough to believe that destroying families is a viable career strategy. And the truth is that you're about to lose everything because you underestimated the woman you married. I didn't underestimate you, David said, his voice now cold and dangerous. I know exactly who you are. Sarah, you're passive, predictable, and weak. You've never fought for anything in your life because you've never had to. Everything you have came from me, and everything you'll have in the future will depend on my generosity. David, tomorrow morning you'll discover just how wrong you are about me. Tomorrow morning I'll have injunctions stopping every paper you try to file. David shot back. Tomorrow morning Jessica and I will be on a plane to the Cayman Islands, where we'll have access to accounts your lawyers will never find. And tomorrow evening, you'll be sitting in this empty penthouse, realizing that you destroyed your marriage and your financial security over nothing. Sarah felt her daughter moving inside her, responding to her elevated heart rate and stress hormones. For a moment, she felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of what was happening at the end of her marriage, the destruction of everything she had thought her life would be, the uncertainty of raising a child alone. But then she remembered the recording on her phone, David's casual discussion of manipulating her postpartum depression. She remembered Jessica Walsh's confident assumption that she could claim David publicly without consequences. She remembered Marcus Thompson's photographs and Michael Anderson's financial analysis. David, Sarah said quietly, you made one crucial mistake in all your planning. What mistake? You assumed I would stay the woman you married 20 years ago. You assumed I would never grow stronger, never get smarter, never learn to fight back. You planned my destruction based on who I used to be, not who I became. David's eyes narrowed. Sarah, you haven't become anything except paranoid and vindictive. I became my daughter's mother, Sarah replied. And that woman doesn't accept abuse from anyone, including her child's father. David stepped closer, his hands clenched into fists. Sarah, you're about to destroy everything we've built together. Our family, our reputation, our future, all of it will be gone because you couldn't handle the fact that marriages sometimes change. David, you destroyed our family when you started stealing from our daughter's inheritance to fund your affair. You destroyed our reputation when you decided to humiliate your pregnant wife in public restaurants. You destroyed our future when you chose Jessica Walsh over the woman who supported you for 20 years. You want to ruin me. David's voice was now raw with rage and desperation. You want to take everything I've worked for and give it to lawyers and judges who don't understand what it takes to build a business. Fine, Sarah. But understand this, if you ruin me, I'll ruin you first. Sarah looked at her husband of 20 years and realized she was seeing him clearly for the first time. The charm was gone, the manipulation was obvious, and the underlying cruelty that had probably always been there was finally visible. David, you can't ruin me, she said with perfect calm. I already know the truth about who you are. There's nothing left for you to threaten me with. That's when David's hands came up to her shoulders. Sarah saw the rage in his eyes, felt the pressure of his grip, and realized with crystal clarity that her husband was about to push his pregnant wife down a marble staircase. "You want to see what ruin looks like?" "Sarah," David said, his voice barely controlled. "You want to see what happens when you push me too far?" Sarah felt his hands tighten on her shoulders, felt the pressure that meant he was about to shove her backward. In that split second, she made a decision that would change everything. She activated the voice recording app on her phone. "David, let go of me," she said clearly, making sure her words would be captured. "You're hurting me." "I'm showing you what real power looks like," David replied, his grip increasing. "I'm showing you what happens when you threaten a man who has everything to lose." Sarah felt herself being pushed backward, felt the marble steps behind her, felt gravity taking over as David's hands shoved her away from him. The sensation of falling seemed to last forever, the marble rushing up to meet her, the sound of her own scream echoing through the penthouse, the final impact that sent everything into darkness. The last thing Sarah heard before losing consciousness was David's panicked voice. "Oh God, Sarah, Sarah, can you hear me? What have I done?" But Sarah Williams had accomplished exactly what she needed to accomplish. Her phone, still recording, had captured every word of David's threats and the sound of her falling. The security cameras in their hallway had recorded David's violence. And somewhere in Manhattan, Rebecca Goldman was preparing to file papers that would destroy David Williams more completely than he had ever imagined possible. Sarah's midlife transformation was complete. Her journey from passive wife to strategic opponent had ended with her millionaire husband literally pushing her into the evidence that would destroy him. David Williams had just made the most expensive mistake of his life, and Sarah Williams, even unconscious at the bottom of marble stairs, had finally won. 6 months later, Sarah Williams sat in her new apartment overlooking Central Park, rocking her daughter Emma. Sarah Williams to sleep. The space was smaller than the penthouse but filled with natural light and the kind of peace that money couldn't buy. At 4 months old, Emma had her mother's dark eyes and an alertness that suggested she would inherit Sarah's analytical mind. The divorce settlement had indeed become legendary in Manhattan legal circles. $78 million, full custody, and David's agreement to supervise visitation only. The punitive damages alone had exceeded Rebecca Goldman's most optimistic projections, largely because David's criminal charges had made him desperate to avoid additional prosecution for domestic violence. David Williams was currently serving 18 months in federal prison for tax evasion and fraud. His real estate empire had collapsed when his business partners discovered the extent of his illegal activities. Jessica Walsh had disappeared after testifying against him, her brief career as a millionaire's mistress having ended with her facing her own criminal charges for participating in financial fraud. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from Maria Santos. "Mija, I'm bringing dinner tonight. Cuban food and gossip about the latest Manhattan wife who hired Rebecca to destroy her cheating husband. You've started a revolution." Sarah smiled, adjusting Emma's blanket as her daughter settled into sleep. The revolution Maria mentioned was real. Rebecca Goldman's practice had tripled in size as word spread about Sarah's victory. Women across Manhattan were finally understanding that they didn't have to accept financial abuse or emotional manipulation from their wealthy husbands. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Rebecca Goldman stood in the hallway, carrying a bottle of expensive champagne and wearing the satisfied expression of a lawyer who had just won another impossible case. "Sarah, I have news that's going to make your day," Rebecca announced, settling into the comfortable chair across from the rocking chair. "David's lawyers just contacted me about modifying his visitation rights." "What kind of modification?" "He wants to give them up entirely," Rebecca replied. "Apparently, federal prison has given David time to reflect on his priorities, and he's decided that Emma would be better off without him in her life." Sarah felt a complex mix of emotions: relief that she wouldn't have to coordinate with David about Emma's upbringing, sadness that her daughter would grow up without a father, and satisfaction that David had finally recognized the depth of his own damage. What does that mean legally? It means Emma inherits everything when she turns 18, and David has no legal claim to any relationship with her unless she chooses to pursue one as an adult. "Sarah, you've won completely. Your daughter will grow up knowing that her mother fought for her and won." As Rebecca left, Sarah returned to the rocking chair and looked out at Central Park. Emma stirred in her arms, making the small sounds that meant she was dreaming. Sarah wondered what her daughter would think about all this when she was old enough to understand the mother who had been pushed down marble stairs by her father, the legal battle that had destroyed him, the choice to fight back against abuse instead of accepting it. Sarah's phone rang, Marcus Thompson's gravelly voice bringing news that felt like perfect closure. Mrs. Williams, I thought you'd want to know Jessica Walsh was sentenced today. 3 years probation, full restitution to you, and a felony conviction that will follow her for the rest of her life. She also has to complete 200 hours of community service, specifically working with domestic violence survivors. How is she handling it? Not well, Marcus replied with obvious satisfaction. Turns out being a millionaire's mistress doesn't prepare you for real-world consequences. Jessica Walsh went from designer apartments to sharing a studio with 3 roommates. She's working at a nail salon in Queens and taking the subway to work. Sarah felt no sympathy for Jessica Walsh. The young woman had actively participated in David's plan to defraud Sarah, had celebrated the idea of destroying a family, and had helped David plan his cover-up after pushing his pregnant wife down the stairs. Jessica's destruction was justice, not tragedy. After ending the call, Sarah opened her laptop and reviewed the speech she was giving next week at the Manhattan Women's Business Network. Her story had become a case study in recognizing financial abuse and fighting back strategically. Women across the city were learning that divorce settlements could be weapons of justice when used properly. Emma woke up hungry, and Sarah settled into feeding her daughter while mentally reviewing her new life. The marketing firm was thriving under her renewed focus and energy. Her investment portfolio, managed by advisors Rebecca had recommended, was growing steadily. Her support network of women who had fought similar battles was expanding weekly. Most importantly, Sarah had discovered something about herself that 20 years of marriage had buried. She was genuinely formidable when properly motivated. The woman who had built a successful business from nothing, who had analyzed David's behavior patterns and gathered evidence systematically, who had outmaneuvered a millionaire with the precision of a military campaign, that woman had always existed. She had just been hidden under decades of trying to be the perfect wife. Sarah's midlife transformation hadn't just changed her circumstances. It had revealed who she actually was beneath the roles she had played for others. The successful executive, the strategic thinker, the protective mother, the loyal friend, all of it was authentic in ways her marriage had never been. As Emma finished eating and settled back into sleep, Sarah felt a contentment that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with authenticity. She had fought for her daughter's future and won. She had stood up to narcissistic abuse and emerged stronger. She had discovered that women supporting women could overcome any obstacle when properly organized. The sun was setting over Central Park, painting Emma's nursery in golden light. Sarah looked at her sleeping daughter and made a silent promise Emma would grow up knowing that her mother was strong enough to protect her from anyone who tried to harm them. She would learn that fighting back against abuse was not only acceptable, but necessary. She would understand that women who support each other are unstoppable when properly motivated. Sarah's greatest fall down those marble stairs had indeed become her highest rise. Her divorce settlement had become legendary not just for its size, but for what it represented, proof that underestimating your wife could be the most expensive mistake a millionaire could make. David Williams had pushed the wrong woman, and Sarah Williams had pushed back harder than he ever imagined possible. Her daughter would inherit not just financial security, but the knowledge that her mother had fought for justice and won decisively. Sarah's story was complete, but her impact was just beginning. Across Manhattan, women were learning that they didn't have to accept financial abuse, emotional manipulation, or domestic violence. They were learning that strategic planning, professional help, and women supporting women could defeat even the most sophisticated attempts at control. Emma Sarah Williams would grow up in a world where her mother had helped change the rules, where wives were no longer expected to accept whatever treatment their husbands decided they deserved. That legacy was worth more than any divorce settlement, more valuable than any amount of money, and more powerful than any man who thought he could push a woman around without consequences. As I finished documenting Sarah's story, I realized I had witnessed something extraordinary. This wasn't just about one woman's divorce, it was about a fundamental shift in how smart, successful women approach marriage, motherhood, and self-protection in the modern world. Sarah Williams had transformed from victim to victor, from passive wife to powerful advocate, From isolated woman to leader of a movement, her millionaire ex-husband had lost everything. But Sarah had gained something invaluable, the absolute certainty that she would never again allow anyone to diminish her strength. Her greatest fall had become her greatest triumph, exactly as she had planned from the moment she decided to fight back. The revolution Maria had mentioned was real, and Sarah Williams had started it by refusing to stay down when pushed. Emma stirred in her arms, and Sarah began humming a lullaby, her voice strong and clear in the golden evening light. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to help other women find their strength, new chances to build the kind of world where Emma could grow up safe and strong. But tonight, Sarah simply held her daughter and savored the peace that came from knowing she had fought for justice and won completely. Her midlife transformation was finished, her financial independence was secure, and her commitment to women supporting women would continue for the rest of her life. David Williams had pushed the wrong woman down those stairs, and Sarah Williams had used that fall to rise higher than she had ever imagined possible. The story was ending exactly as it should, with the victor holding her greatest treasure in her arms, while her defeated opponent faced the consequences of his choices alone. Justice, Sarah reflected, was a beautiful thing when properly served. 3 years after Sarah Williams's divorce settlement made headlines across Manhattan's legal community, I returned to interview her about the long-term impact of her victory. What I discovered was a story that extended far beyond one woman's triumph over an abusive husband. It was about how strategic resistance to narcissistic abuse had created a movement that was changing marriage dynamics across America. Sarah's apartment overlooking Central Park had evolved into something between a home and a headquarters. Emma, now 3.5, played with building blocks in the corner, while Sarah reviewed case files for the Sarah Williams Foundation, a nonprofit organization she had established to help women recognize and escape financial abuse. Michael, Sarah said, settling into the chair where I had first interviewed her months after David's attack, I never intended to become an advocate. I just wanted to protect my daughter and get justice for what David did to us. But the response from women across the country has been overwhelming. The Sarah Williams Foundation had processed over 2,500 requests for help in its first year alone. Sarah's story, published in major magazines and featured on network television, had inspired women to examine their own marriages with new clarity. More importantly, it had provided a roadmap for strategic resistance that was proving devastatingly effective. The pattern is always the same, Sarah explained, pulling out a folder thick with correspondence. A successful woman starts noticing inconsistencies in her husband's behavior, financial secrecy, emotional manipulation, escalating control. She finds my story, realizes she's not crazy, and starts documenting everything instead of making excuses. Rebecca Goldman's law practice had expanded into a boutique firm specializing in high-asset divorces involving financial abuse. Her success rate was unprecedented, largely because Sarah's case had established legal precedents that made it easier to prove financial fraud and emotional manipulation in divorce proceedings. Sarah changed the game, Rebecca told me during our interview at her expanded offices. Before her case, financial abuse was hard to prove and even harder to prosecute. Now we have a template that works. Hide marital assets. We freeze everything. Gaslight your wife about finances. We have expert witnesses who can testify about psychological manipulation. Try to use pregnancy or childbirth against a woman. We demand punitive damages that make it financially ruinous. The financial impact was staggering. In the 3 years since Sarah's settlement, similar cases in New York alone had resulted in over $400 million in damages awarded to wives whose husbands had attempted financial fraud during divorce proceedings. Insurance companies were beginning to adjust their policies, and prenuptial agreement language was evolving to address the specific tactics Sarah's case had exposed. But the most dramatic changes were happening in how women approached marriage itself. Dr. Jennifer Kim, the physician who had treated Sarah after David's attack, had become one of the leading researchers on domestic violence in affluent communities. Her studies, partially funded by the Sarah Williams Foundation, were revealing patterns that had previously been invisible to healthcare providers. What Sarah's case taught us, Dr. Kim explained during our interview at Mount Sinai Hospital, is that domestic violence in wealthy families looks different from what we're trained to recognize. It's not black eyes and broken bones, it's financial control, psychological manipulation, and the systematic destruction of a woman's sense of reality. Sarah's documentation methods have become a model for how we help other patients recognize and document abuse. The medical community was now screening for financial abuse as routinely as they screened for physical violence. Emergency rooms, obstetric practices, and family medicine clinics across the country had implemented protocols inspired by Sarah's experience. Maria Santos had leveraged her friendship with Sarah into a consulting practice that helped women identify and escape narcissistic relationships. Her waiting list extended 6 months, and her success stories were becoming legendary in their own right. Mija, Maria told me over coffee in the same village wine bar where she and Sarah had planned David's destruction. What people don't understand is that Sarah's victory wasn't just about money. It was about proving that women don't have to accept abuse just because it comes from wealthy, successful men. Every woman who hires me has read about Sarah. They know that fighting back is possible. Maria's clients included CEOs, doctors, lawyers, and entrepreneurs, women who had previously felt trapped in abusive marriages because their social circles couldn't believe that successful, charming men could be predators. Sarah's story had given them permission to trust their instincts and fight back strategically. Marcus Thompson, the private investigator who had helped expose David's fraud, had seen his business triple in size. His investigative techniques, refined during Sarah's case, had become the industry standard for uncovering financial abuse. Mrs. Williams changed how we approach these cases, Marcus explained during our meeting at his expanded offices. Before her, wives hired investigators to prove adultery. Now they hire us to uncover financial fraud, document psychological abuse, and build comprehensive cases that destroy abusive husbands completely. The evidence standards she established have made it possible to expose financial abuse that would have been invisible 5 years ago. Marcus had trained investigators across the country in Sarah's documentation methods. The private investigation industry was experiencing unprecedented growth as women learned they could gather evidence strategically instead of suffering in silence. But perhaps the most significant impact was on the abusers themselves. David Williams, released from federal prison after serving 14 months, had attempted to rebuild his life and failed spectacularly. His criminal conviction made it impossible to obtain licenses for real estate development. His reputation in Manhattan's business community was permanently destroyed. Most of his former associates refused to take his calls, and those who did insisted on background checks that revealed the full extent of his abuse of Sarah. David tried to present himself as the victim, Rebecca Goldman told me, reviewing David's post-prison legal filings. He claimed Sarah had manipulated the legal system, that he was the real victim of psychological abuse, that his criminal conviction was unjust. But the evidence was overwhelming, and the business community in Manhattan isn't stupid. Nobody wants to partner with a man who pushed his pregnant wife down marble stairs. David's attempts to re-establish himself in other cities had failed when prospective business partners discovered his history. Background checks now routinely included searches for domestic violence convictions, largely because Sarah's case had demonstrated how financial abuse could destroy business partnerships and investment opportunities. Jessica Walsh's trajectory served as a cautionary tale for young women who might consider similar relationships. Her felony conviction had made it impossible to find employment in finance, marketing, or any field requiring background checks. She had eventually moved to a small town in Ohio, where she worked as a server in a diner and lived in a studio apartment above a convenience store. Jessica calls sometimes, Sarah told me, showing me blocked phone numbers on her cell phone. She wants to explain her side or ask for help finding employment. She seems to think that because I won my case, I should help her rebuild her life. She still doesn't understand that actions have consequences. The contrast between Jessica's destruction and Sarah's success had become a powerful deterrent for other potential mistresses. Young women in Manhattan's professional circles had learned that participating in the financial abuse of a wife could result in criminal charges, felony convictions, and permanent employment difficulties. Sarah's own transformation continued to accelerate 3 years after her victory. The Sarah Williams Foundation had grown into a multi-million-dollar organization with staff in 12 cities. Sarah's speaking engagements commanded fees of $52,000 per appearance, and her autobiography, The Fall That Freed Me, A Woman's Guide to Strategic Resistance, had spent 18 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list. "Michael," Sarah said, watching Emma build an elaborate tower with her blocks. I sometimes think about the woman I was 4 years ago. She was so afraid of conflict, so committed to keeping the peace, so convinced that being a good wife meant accepting whatever treatment David decided she deserved. That woman would be amazed by what we've accomplished. Emma's tower fell over, and she immediately began rebuilding it with the focused determination that seemed to characterize everything she did. At 3.5, she displayed the analytical thinking and strategic planning that had made her mother formidable. Does Emma ask about her father? I asked. She knows she has a father who can't be part of our family because he made dangerous choices, Sarah replied. When she's older, I'll explain everything in age-appropriate ways. But for now, she knows that her mother fought to protect her, and that's enough. Emma looked up from her blocks and smiled at her mother with the confident happiness of a child who had never doubted her safety or security. The contrast with Sarah's own childhood spent walking on eggshells around her parents' volatile marriage was stark and intentional. I'm raising Emma to recognize manipulation from the beginning, Sarah continued. She'll never accept gaslighting, financial control, or emotional abuse because she'll have seen from birth that women who fight back can win. That's the real legacy of everything that happened with David. The broader cultural impact of Sarah's story was becoming visible in marriage and divorce statistics across affluent communities. Divorce rates among couples earning over $200,000 annually had increased by 23% in the 3 years since Sarah's case, with women initiating 78% of those divorces. More significantly, the average settlement amounts had increased by 45% as women learned to document financial abuse and demand punitive damages. Sarah's case created a new category of divorce, explained Dr. Patricia Morgan, a sociologist at Columbia University who had studied the impact of high-profile domestic violence cases. Before her, wealthy women often stayed in abusive marriages because they feared social judgment or financial insecurity. Sarah proved that fighting back strategically could result in complete financial independence and social vindication. She gave women permission to prioritize their own well-being over social expectations. The insurance industry had been forced to adapt to new realities about financial liability in domestic violence cases. Policies covering professional liability, personal assets, and business operations now included specific language about domestic violence convictions and financial abuse findings. The cost of abusing your wife had become quantifiable and enormous. Corporate America was also adapting to new realities about executive behavior. Background checks for senior positions now routinely included searches for domestic violence history, and several high-profile executives had been terminated when their personal conduct became liability issues for their companies. The business community learned from David Williams's example, explained James Peterson, a corporate consultant who specialized in executive risk management. If your CEO is convicted of pushing his pregnant wife downstairs, that's not just a personal problem, it's a corporate reputation crisis. Companies can't afford to employ executives who demonstrate that level of poor judgment and potential liability. Religious communities had also been forced to confront new realities about domestic violence in successful families. Several high-profile cases involving clergy and prominent church members had revealed that financial abuse and psychological manipulation were common in communities that emphasized traditional gender roles and male authority. Sarah's story challenged a lot of assumptions about what domestic violence looks like, explained Dr. Rachel Thompson, a theologian who had written extensively about faith communities and domestic violence. Many religious communities had assumed that successful, charming men couldn't be abusers, and that wives who complained about psychological manipulation were being overly sensitive. Sarah's documentation and legal victory forced us to confront the reality that domestic violence in religious communities often looks like financial control and emotional manipulation. The legal profession itself had evolved in response to Sarah's case. Law schools now taught courses on financial abuse documentation, and continuing education requirements for family law attorneys included training on recognizing and proving psychological manipulation in divorce proceedings. Sarah Williams changed how we practice family law, explained Professor Michael Chen, no relation to this author at NYU Law School. Before her case, financial abuse was difficult to prove and often dismissed as he said, she said disputes. Sarah's systematic documentation and strategic legal approach created a new standard for how these cases should be prepared and prosecuted. The most remarkable aspect of Sarah's ongoing impact was how her methods had been refined and improved by subsequent cases. The documentation techniques she had pioneered were now taught in domestic violence workshops across the country. The strategic approach she had used to gather evidence and build alliances had become a template for other women facing similar situations. What Sarah proved, Maria Santos told me, is that domestic violence thrives in isolation and secrecy. When women document everything, build professional support teams, and fight back strategically, abusive men lose their power completely. Sarah's victory wasn't just personal, it was a roadmap for how other women could win similar battles. The Sarah Williams Foundation had developed a comprehensive program for women experiencing financial abuse. The program included legal referrals, investigative support, financial planning assistance, and psychological counseling specifically designed for survivors of narcissistic abuse. Most importantly, it connected women with others who had successfully escaped similar situations. The isolation is what makes financial abuse so effective, Sarah explained, reviewing testimonials from women who had used the foundation's services. Abusive men convince their wives that they're crazy, paranoid, or ungrateful. When women connect with others who have experienced identical manipulation, they realize they're not alone and they're not imagining things. The foundation's success stories were remarkable. In 3 years, it had helped 847 women document financial abuse, escape abusive marriages, and secure financial independence. The average settlement in cases where the foundation had provided support was $12.3 million compared to $1 million in similar cases before Sarah's methods became widely known. The psychological impact on the abusers themselves was becoming a subject of academic study. Men who had used financial control and emotional manipulation to dominate their wives were discovering that these tactics no longer worked when women had access to Sarah's documentation methods and strategic approaches. Narcissistic abuse relies on the victim's isolation and self-doubt, explained Dr. Lisa Rodriguez, a psychologist who specialized in treating both survivors and perpetrators of domestic violence. When women have systematic methods for documenting abuse and building support networks, narcissistic men lose their primary weapons. They can't gaslight someone who has recorded evidence of their behavior. Some abusive men had attempted to adapt by becoming more subtle in their manipulation, but Sarah's foundation had anticipated this evolution. The documentation methods they taught women had become increasingly sophisticated, and the legal support network had expanded to address new forms of psychological manipulation. David Williams and men like him think they're playing chess while their wives are playing checkers, Sarah told me. But when women have access to professional support, systematic documentation methods, and legal representation that understands narcissistic abuse, the game changes completely. We're not just playing their game better, we're playing a completely different game that they can't win. The international impact of Sarah's story was also becoming visible. Women's rights organizations in 12 countries had translated her documentation methods into local legal frameworks. The strategic approach she had pioneered was being adapted to address financial abuse in different cultural and legal contexts. Sarah's methods work because they're based on universal principles, explained Dr. Patricia Kim, an international human rights lawyer who had helped adapt Sarah's techniques for use in other countries. Financial abuse looks different in different cultures, but the underlying dynamics are the same. When women document everything, build professional support networks, and fight back strategically, they can overcome even sophisticated attempts at control and manipulation. The business world had also learned valuable lessons from Sarah's case about the hidden costs of employing abusive executives. Companies were increasingly screening for domestic violence history during hiring processes, and several major corporations had implemented programs to help employees recognize and report financial abuse in their personal relationships. The Sarah Williams case taught us that domestic violence isn't just a personal issue, it's a business liability, explained Jennifer Walsh, no relation to David's former mistress, a corporate HR executive who had developed domestic violence prevention programs for Fortune 500 companies. Employees experiencing financial abuse are less productive, more likely to miss work, and more vulnerable to making poor decisions that affect company operations. Supporting them isn't just the right thing to do, it's good business. As my interviews with Sarah and her extended network continued, I was struck by how completely her story had changed the landscape for women experiencing domestic violence in affluent communities. The myth that domestic violence only happened in poor families had been shattered, and the tools for fighting back had been democratized through the Foundation's work. The most important thing Sarah proved, Rebecca Goldman told me during our final interview, is that domestic violence is about power and control, not poverty or lack of education. Wealthy, successful men can be just as abusive as anyone else. They're just better at hiding it and more sophisticated in their methods. Sarah's case gave us the tools to expose that abuse and fight back effectively. 3 years after David Williams pushed his pregnant wife down marble stairs, the ripple effects of his violence had destroyed not just his own life, but the lives of countless other abusive men who thought they could control their wives through financial manipulation and psychological abuse. Sarah's strategic resistance had become a movement that was changing marriage dynamics across America and beyond. Emma Williams, now 3.5, would grow up in a world where her mother's courage had made it safer for women to fight back against domestic violence. She would never know a world where wives were expected to accept financial abuse as normal, where successful men could hide behind their reputations while terrorizing their families, or where women had to choose between their safety and their financial security. That's the real victory, Sarah told me as our series of interviews concluded. Not the money, not the legal precedents, not even David's destruction. The real victory is that Emma will grow up in a world where women like me have made it easier for the next generation to recognize abuse and fight back effectively. As I left Sarah's apartment that final afternoon, I reflected on how completely one woman's strategic resistance had changed the landscape for domestic violence survivors across the country. Sarah Williams had transformed from victim to victor to advocate to movement leader, and her impact was still expanding 3 years after her triumph. David Williams had pushed the wrong woman down those marble stairs, and the consequences of his violence were still rippling through society in ways he could never have imagined. Sarah's fall had become not just her own rise, but a catalyst for social change that was making it safer for women everywhere to fight back against abuse. The revolution Maria Santos had mentioned in those early days after Sarah's victory was real, and it was accelerating. Women supporting women, armed with Sarah's methods and inspired by her example, were proving that even the most sophisticated forms of domestic violence could be overcome through strategic resistance and systematic documentation. Sarah Williams had kept her promise to her unborn daughter. She had changed the world to make it safer for the next generation of women. Emma would inherit not just financial security, but a society where her mother's courage had made it possible for women to fight back against abuse and win decisively. The story of Sarah Williams and David Williams had become more than a cautionary tale about the dangers of underestimating your wife. It had become a roadmap for social change that was still being followed by women across America and around the world. Justice, as Sarah had discovered, was indeed a beautiful thing when properly served. And when served systematically, strategically, and with the support of women helping women, justice could change the world.